Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Busboys and Poets Books Presents, an in-house and virtual series where we bring the amazing, magnificent, and wonderful artists, authors, writers, what have you, where we host them in store and we host them on your screen so that we can share their amazing words and stories with you. And tonight is an especially just fantastic story that I can't wait to share with you. Tonight, we have the Kilby cousins for their book Cousins Connected Through Slavery. A Black woman and a white woman discover their past and each other. And now, this is interesting, and we'll get into why exactly with the authors themselves, but I do want to read out their short little bios for them both so we can get to know them. Dr. Betty Kilby Fisher Baldwin grew up in rural Virginia. Thanks to her father's determination, she entered and graduated from Warren County High School after suing the school board based on the landmark Supreme Court case Brown v. Board of Education of '54. Later in life, she documented her experience and published her autobiography, Wit, Will, and Walls. Betty frequently speaks with Phoebe about making connections across the racial divide to create a more and just peaceful world. And Phoebe, of course, Phoebe Kilby, grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, knowing nothing of Betty. Discovering in 2006 that she was a descendant of enslavers, Phoebe was inspired by the Coming to the Table movement to connect with descendants of persons her family enslaved and contacted Betty in 2007. She's dedicated to helping others, European Americans and African Americans together to uncover and explore the truths of their experiences and move toward racial reconciliation. And before I bring our lovely ladies on screen, they do have some special news. Betty was featured in a new Netflix documentary released on Christmas Day 2021, The Stories of a Generation with Pope Francis. And you can see her and Phoebe in episode 2. And without further ado, here are Phoebe and Betty. Hello.
Hello.
Hello. How you doing? I'm Betty Kilby Baldwin. My ancestors were slaves.
And I'm Phoebe Kilby, a descendant of persons who once enslaved Betty's family. And we have come to the table.
Phoebe and I were inspired to meet and to get to know each other by coming to the table, an organization and a movement focused on racial reconciliation through honest truth-telling, deep connection, genuine forgiveness, and sincere actions to make amends for the harms of slavery and its legacies. The name Coming to the Table refers to Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, when he says, I have a dream that the sons of former slaves and former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. And as we say, sisterhood. The book Cousins is our coming to the table story.
So I'm going to speak first here about coming to the table in the sense of how it inspired us to get to know each other. Because I was the one that discovered it first when I came to work at Eastern Mennonite University for their Center for Justice and Peace Building. And that's a small college in Harrisonburg, Virginia. And I arrived there in 2006. And when I did, I found out that there had been a gathering earlier in the year of people who were descendants of enslavers and people who were descendants of enslaved people to talk about racial justice and racial reconciliation. And I thought this was an intriguing idea to bring together people who were linked through slavery. And it made me wonder, had my family enslaved people? Well, I just didn't know. My father's family, the Kilbys, never talked about it. My father never said a word. I grew up in Baltimore, and he had grown up in Virginia where this enslaving occurred, but he never said anything to me about it. So, but when I thought about it, there were a lot of clues that we could have, my family could have enslaved people. The first things, I knew that the family had deep roots in Virginia since before the American Revolution, and they still had farms there. But the other thing is that, when I really think back, there's my father's and his family racial attitudes. My father and grandmother often spoke disparagingly about African Americans, and that's a nice way to put it. So I grew up in a racist household. Well, I grew up in Baltimore, later went to school in North Carolina, but I eventually moved to Virginia. And when I moved there in 1994 to Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, I noticed in the newspaper, in the local newspaper, that Kilbys were mentioned often, and they were activists, and they were Black. I never really thought to look into whether I had connections with these people. Maybe I just was afraid to, or just didn't want to contemplate it. But I didn't, I was kind of clueless about this whole thing. But when I found out about coming to the table, it gave me the courage to explore this aspect of my family's history. And I began the research. First of all, going to Rappahannock County, Virginia, and meeting with the Historical Society there, the head of the staff person there, who gave me a lot of clues and helped me find through the U.S. Census that my great-great-grandfather had indeed enslaved people. It was pretty shocking to see that there, right in black and white, so to speak, that my great-great-grandfather in 1840 had enslaved 2 people. Earlier it was 4 people. Did he sell them? I don't know. But it's pretty hard to look at. But in many ways, it made sense to me because of my family's attitudes. It just seemed like they would be the type that would enslave people. But I also did some online research, and I quickly found Betty because she had a website, and she had written her first book, an autobiography called Wit, Will, and Walls. So I ordered the book, and when I read it, I just knew we had to be connected. For example, one of the main clues was I could see that her father grew up on a farm that was located within about a mile of where my father's family farm was. But I learned a lot more about from that book than just that. I learned that Betty and her family had been leaders in integrating Warren County High School in Front Royal, Virginia in 1958 and 59. Wow, think about that. A lot of school systems were not integrated into the late 60s and 70s. So this was pretty early on to be challenging a school system. Well, she did it, she and her family, and it's an overwhelming story of bravery and grit. And Betty's going to tell you more about this in a few minutes. But at this point, I didn't have proof that our families were connected. I knew that my father grew up near where her father grew up. I knew that my family had enslaved people, but I didn't know if we were directly connected. So I thought I'd go back to my friends at coming to the table and tell them what I'd found and see what their reaction was and what they would suggest. And I thought maybe they'd give me genealogical research advice. But instead, the person I talked to, Will Hairston, one of the founders of Coming to the Table, he said, "Phoebe, if you want to know the answer, you're going to have to contact Betty. Next week is Martin Luther King Day, and that would be a good day to do it." Whoa, I had just, in the last month, figured out that my family had enslaved people, and he wanted me to contact Betty? Wow. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, Martin Luther King Day would be a good day to do this. It would be a symbolic day, maybe an inspiring day to do this. So that's what I did. And I'm going to read you the email that I sent to Betty on January 15th, 2007, Martin Luther King Day. We have it in our book Cousins here. And the subject line is an invitation to conversation. And she was Betty Kilby Fisher at the time. So I said, "Dear Betty Kilby Fisher, my name is Phoebe Kilby, and I am white. My father grew up in Rappahannock County, Virginia, near where your father grew up. I have been doing some research on my family and have also read your book. Having no definitive answers, I suspect that our families had some kind of relationship in the past. I admire very much your courage and the courage of your father and family during the civil rights era and since. It would be an honor to talk to you and meet you someday. I live about 25 miles from Front Royal. Through conversations, we both might find out a little bit more about our family's past. Martin Luther King had a dream that the sons of former slaves and slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. Perhaps we as daughters can contribute to fulfilling that dream. I hope to hear from you and to hear that you are interested in conversing with me. Phoebe Kilby. Well, I hit send and off it went. But the first day I didn't hear anything. And then the next day, no response. A week went by, no response. And then almost 2 weeks. And I thought, oh gosh, she probably doesn't want to talk to me. Why would she? Why would she want to talk to a descendant of people who had perhaps enslaved her family? So I went back to my friends at coming to the table to tell them of the lack of response. And I talked to a number of them, and the suggestion I got was, well, Phoebe, your first email was, it was pretty good, but maybe you ought to send a longer one and tell Betty more about yourself so she knows what she's getting into. So that's what I did. And I'm not going to read that whole long email, but I hit send, and within an hour or so, I got a response from Betty. And the subject line of her email was, "Hello, cousin." Wow. I was truly touched. And her email was so open and welcoming. I didn't know if we were cousins, but I felt honored that she had opened her heart enough to call me cousin. So now I'd like to turn the mic, so to speak, over to my cousin Betty, who will provide her perspective on our meeting and also tell you her amazing story.
Well, Phoebe suspected what I had known practically all my life. It was only natural for me to respond, "Hello, cousin." But here's the email that I sent back to her. "Phoebe, if you're asking yourself why I'm so emotional, the Cultural Innovations email address gets full of spam mail and is often down. I went to the site this morning and emails began to download. It could only have been God. We are the key to healing. Meeting you today is so awesome. People will find it hard to believe. I can't believe it. I have known that we were descendants of slaves, but I couldn't open that door. We can not only contribute to Dr. King's dream, we can bring about racial reconciliation and healing to a nation of hurting people. I thank God for bringing you into my life." Signed, Betty Kilby Fisher. Well, when I heard from Phoebe, I was going around the world selling my book and talking about forgiveness and love. The last thing I expected was a white woman challenging me to live Dr. Martin Luther King's dream. But here she was. A documentary based on my book, Wit, Will, and Walls, was about to premiere. Without thinking, I accepted the challenge and invited Phoebe to our family dinner and the premiere of Wit, Will, and Walls. I forgot to tell my family that the descendants of the family that once owned our family was coming to dinner. Our family was gracious, but there were a few mutterings like, "What are you looking for? How long are you going to hang around? Where's my 40 acres and a mule?" Didn't bother either one of us. At the premiere, I told the audience, "Tonight we are living Dr. King's dream of the sons and daughters of former slaves and former slave owners coming to the table of brotherhood." It was truly a night to remember. Then we played the documentary that you will see now.
See, supreme being seen as many things, but no one seems to see love reigns. Emotional cascade, wet all, bathe them in a sense of self-confidence and purpose before and after the sermons, all the preaching. What are we teaching the children? Teaching one another.
So much of the focus on civil rights history and scholarship has been on the triumphs and the strategies to achieve those triumphs. And so the focus was on those legal cases and how they constructed an argument and put the community behind these children and then got them into the school and then left them in that school.
Betty Kilby Fisher's story takes us to a deeply personal place in which we have to face some of what happened to individual students as a result of efforts to desegregate the schools.
What she is accomplishing now is something that Americans never accomplished in 1900. We've never had an opportunity to look back over the dark history of slavery and race relations in our country and to look these institutions squarely in the eye and to seek understanding and reconciliation.
Much of the beauty of her book is in the complexity, and the soul loves complexity. Things aren't neat and cut and dried.
As she's been telling to many people during the last several years, helping move that shift in the center of gravity in American history ever farther forward, helping us all come to grips with all aspects of our history.
When I heard him cry out, and he was saying, "Lord, I stretch my hands to thee. No other help I know." And I moved in to get closer, and he was crying. And I got scared.
Education was so important to the Kilby family, especially Betty's father, because he had lost land. He felt like had he been more educated, he would have been able to hold on to that land.
And so what we learn is a young child who has agreed to be a plaintiff in one of the many cases that the NAACP litigates throughout Virginia ends up being a victim on more than just a peripheral level.
We like to think that Virginia is like the cradle of Southern society, some would say American society. And so people are very aware of their place in Virginia, and they're very aware of stepping out of their place. And so for people to push during the civil rights era to step out of out of the status quo was just like an affront to civility, to gentility.
The first event occurred on September the 15th, 1958, when Judge Sabloff ruled that based on the landmark Supreme Court decision, they couldn't deny me and 22 others from attending the only high school in the county. The governor of Virginia closed our schools rather than to comply with Sabloff's rulings. My school became the first school in the history of our nation to close because of the massive resistance loss.
They actually believed, some of them, that if they resisted enough that they would get the Supreme Court to come to its senses and that the Supreme Court would change its mind. To me, massive resistance instead really exploded the myth that Virginia somehow presided over a superior system of race relations, that in fact that white supremacy in Virginia was always based upon the inferiority of African Americans and a belief that blacks were inferior, and that while perhaps there was more latitude for blacks in Virginia to advance economically and educationally, there was always a limit to that.
There is such strong feelings against desegregating the schools that the whites in power will close the schools before they will integrate the schools. This has an emotional and a psychological impact on the black child.
Like water drops on dry earth's surface, one may search this globe 77 years, neither close nor near the truth. Religion may substitute for faith till all faith in religion, not God. Making someone else's decisions within your own life, your soul just ain't right, might be that it lacks love.
So it's not till 1958 that these court cases have made their way through, through the system, and that you finally have a series of judges in different parts of the state ordering that black students be admitted into the white schools in Warren County, Charlottesville, and Norfolk.
And the car stopped at the foot of the hill. And for a long time, I wondered why they made us walk through that crowd. And as I got out the car, the reporters and policemen, people were all lined up. And I walked past this big old fat white woman, and she yelled, "We're gonna kill all you little niggas." And I remember Jimmy pushing me in the back because I had just paralyzed for a minute. And I remember saying, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want."
It's not that moment you walk in the door of the schoolhouse and that's it. It's the day-to-day grind. She said that not one white person reached out to her or befriended her. And it's such a simple thing, such a small act of kindness, but no one did it. And part of it, well, the main reason they didn't was fear, that they might have even wanted to, but were afraid how others would treat them.
I could prepare for a test. Just knew that I was going to make an A on that test. Somebody would come along and say something mean and ugly, and that rage that I recognized came forth. And in the midst of rage, you can't think.
Those children, all of the children, the nameless children, were the soldiers who went out there and fought that battle day after day, because it really was a war.
I always felt guilty about going through the auditorium because the school officials oftentimes locked those doors. And they locked those doors with the purpose of keeping us from crossing over. And it was probably something that was going to keep us safe. And yet I continually went through those doors.
She was beginning to feel confident, beginning to let her guard down. And unfortunately, that's when other people took advantage and she was raped. Then all of a sudden, it's taken from her. You almost feel yourself being catapulted down this tunnel when she went into this deep depression.
Of course, that would be one way in which the system of white supremacy would target black activism.
When I was reading her book and thinking about that attack that she suffered in the auditorium, and I can imagine how traumatized she must have been. And then when she went on to mention in the book how she never told anybody about it, and I thought that is so typical. That happens so many times. I've uncovered so many incidents of that, but that's because black women and girls even were taught never to put themselves in situations where they would be in jeopardy because their men could not do but so much to protect them. And if those men were called upon to protect them, then they themselves would be in jeopardy. So black girls and women shoulder the responsibility not just for their own well-being, but for the well-being of men.
Those were some of the real consequences that people experienced as a result of massive resistance.
Perhaps I see things differently, like peace between you and me is the natural order of interaction, acting like we all God's children, regardless of the factions we fall into or the composition of our genetic tissue. We are human beings, one and the same. Shame we can't hold hands and profess love for one another, my sisters and brothers of the divine creation. What is it you are waiting for? Apocalypse?
Token desegregation really defines the initial wave. It's really not until the late 1960s, early 1970s that you have any sort of meaningful desegregation in the state of Virginia.
NAACP lawyers fought and won more cases in Virginia than in any other place, and just continually hammered away on every front. You began to have Virginia really standing out as a leader in a different way than it had previously.
I applied for another management position. Mr. Baker, the personnel manager, he invited me into his office and he shut the door. I should have known I was in trouble. He said, "What do you want now? How many ways do I have to tell you? You're never going to get anywhere around here because you don't have the experience and you won't get it either." When I got to the car, I said, "Why, God, why? Why me?" I knew he was going to make me fight. And all the way home, I argued, "God, no, please don't make me do this."
This experience, which for many years quieted Betty, impacted her becoming a strong, decisive, assertive woman.
Her spirit is so indomitable that she persists.
I persevered, and in 1986, I became the highest-ranking African-American female at that Fortune 500 company. They gave me a $100,000 education, and baby, I'm using it now.
She still feels the pain of those experiences, and yet she's managed to resist the hatred and bitterness that can come out of it.
I gave a book to a young woman once, and she had done a good deed for me. A couple of days later, I got an email from her, and the email read, "That what you said happened to you when you were a little girl happened to me. My life has been blessed by your story."
The current direction of scholarship is to begin to examine the stories of the lesser knowns. And in that, you get not only the triumphs, you get the tragedies. You get the other side of the story, which is what we need in order to fairly evaluate the period that has passed so that we can figure out what avenues we need to take to continue to make progress.
We cannot just present our kids with a picture and a model of perfect success and overcoming, because that isn't very realistic. You know, there's a lot of pain involved in those sorts of struggles, and we do a disservice to our children if we don't share that.
To share with us and to share with the world things that she did not, that she could not even voice to her own family, helps us to understand where some of the anger and rage comes from as a result of living and existing in a racist society.
The lost cause idea that the Civil War was not fought over the issue of race, but of Southern rights, that race was no problem in the South before the Civil War, closed off any open public discussion of these very troublesome issues.
Increasingly, as we tell the story of people like Betty, and we encourage those people to tell their own stories, then these 13-year-old girls and boys and other young people will realize you don't have to be Dr. King. You don't have to be Julian Bond. You don't have to be Ruby Doris Smith Robinson. You don't have to be famous. These were young folks. Some of them in Birmingham were 8, 9, 10 years old who were willing to go to jail. So if you begin to show people that these were people like them who were the agents of change, it can help to liberate them to the point where they understand they can actually do something. They don't have to wait for somebody to show them the way.
Now allow these thoughts to soak into your better consciousness and grow flowers in your mind. Reclaim the beauty of mankind, for while I sat seeking life, I almost looked beyond love, but now love is all that is within my sight.
The little girl that played me is my granddaughter. The white-haired professor is the first person that made me realize the importance of my story. If you put yourself in my shoes, what would it take for you to go from being terrorized to hello, cousin? For me, it was years of my father telling me that hate was like taking poison to hurt someone else, but the only person that you hurt was yourself. It took looking back over my life and determining who was going to stop me from accomplishing my dreams. then achieving my dreams despite the obstacles. I couldn't prevent these circumstances any more than Phoebe could prevent her family from owning slaves and connecting us by blood. On page 172 in my chapter, I Am Free, I write, when I realized I had the ability to learn and to make good grades, I knew there was something wrong with the many things that I had learned or assumed about myself. I had accepted as fact what some individuals in white society, teachers, and others of influence had said, intentionally meaning to hurt me and keeping me in a state of low self-esteem. I go on to write, I am responsible for the decisions that I make, my actions and responses to situations. I am responsible to seek the truth and acknowledge my history. Nearly 25 years later, in 2007, when Phoebe, a European American woman, contacts me, I thank God she waited until I was ready to take this journey with her. I needed every bit of that time to reply genuinely, hello, cousin.
So, isn't that an incredible video of Betty and her bravery in integrating that school? It was kind of overwhelming to see that the first night I met her. I went to that family dinner, and then afterwards we went to the premiere of that film and sat there in the audience watching who I had gotten contact with. What a person. And, now I've seen that video many, many times, and I continue to be amazed at her bravery and the bravery of her family. And again, it prompts me to think how easy I had it growing up. I can't think of one significant obstacle placed in my path toward getting an education. Well, I met Betty and her family that night, and then Betty went home to Texas, and I was still there in Virginia. So what was next? I really wanted to get to know this family and see if we could connect on a deeper level. Well, it became apparent that an important anniversary was coming up, the 50th anniversary of their integrating Warren County High School. Betty's brother James was living in Front Royal, near where I lived, and he had formed a group called the Historical Education Movement. And the purpose of the group was to honor this school desegregation history, and particularly to honor Betty and James's father, who had been the real power and impetus behind the whole effort to integrate that high school. So I thought, well, maybe if I joined this group, I could get to know James better and also support the family. So I asked him if I could join, and he graciously allowed me to do so. So the first thing on our agenda, which is always an important thing, is to honor the history, was to have a commemorative event on that 50th anniversary date. And we filled an auditorium with people there from the community, as well as people who came back home to Front Royal, who were there during the school desegregation period, both African Americans and European Americans. So Betty was there with her brother and others that integrated the school, as well as some of the people who were there when the governor shut down the school to keep Betty and James from going to going there. So we brought them back together. We celebrated with song and poetry and readings and testimonies about the history, and it was a wonderful event. But James and the group wanted to do more than this. They wanted something more permanent, not just a one-off event. And so we decided that perhaps a good thing to do, or what James really wanted, was this for the school board to name that school after Betty and James's father. And it was a good time to do this because the school board was in the process of renovating the building to convert it from a high school to a middle school, and they were thinking about, well, what should we name this middle school? So our group went to school board meetings, and we were very respectful, and none of the yelling and things that you kind of see now in school board meetings. We just asked them if they wouldn't name the school after James Wilson Kilby. We wrote letters to them, emails, wrote letters to the editor, all that kind of stuff. Several meetings we went to, but the school board refused to do it. They just punted and called it Warren County Middle School. Apparently, there were other people in the community who were pressuring the school board not to name it after James Wilson Kilby. They didn't even bother to show up to the meeting because they had so much power. They knew that they could work on this behind the scenes. Well, as you can imagine, this was very discouraging for James, for Betty, and our group. What would we do now? But we didn't want to give up. So what we decided is that we needed to have more allies in our effort to get the school desegregation history honored. So we applied for a grant from Coming to the Table so that we could host a community dialogue process within the town of Front Royal in Warren County. And the money allowed us to hire 2 outside facilitators to help us guide us in this dialogue process, which we called Our Shared History. And we brought together people from the time frame when the school was integrated, not just students, but also a teacher from that time frame, a bus driver, and then a lot of members of the community, as well as 2 current assistant superintendents of schools. And we met multiple times, often in 3-hour sessions for the next 6 months. And everybody expressed their opinions about this history and its significance. And there were some disagreements at times, and there were some upset people. But we worked through it, and eventually we agreed on an action plan to honor the history. And the first thing on the agenda, well, there were 2 tied for first. But the one I'm going to mention first is we wanted to get this history described and presented in the classroom. So we got the school board to agree that they would talk about the school desegregation history in the 3rd, 7th, and 11th grade levels. And they did do that, at least at the beginning. And I often accompanied James to the elementary school history class where he talked about his role in school desegregation. We're not sure if it's continuing. In fact, we believe that it's no longer being taught, which is very much a shame. But we did also go for something that we knew would likely be more permanent, and that would be a historic marker outside the school. One of those Virginia roadside markers that you see around the state. And lucky for us, the Virginia Department of Historic Resources was rethinking their program. They realized that the history that was being presented was kind of lopsided. It was focused on the houses of founding fathers or Civil War battlefields. And so they were hungry for other stories to tell. And when we came with this idea, they snapped it up and supported us on this, and we got the school board to pay for the marker. So now we're going to show a TV coverage of the dedication of the marker, because you'll see how a community came together to do something really positive in honoring civil rights history. So Lori, we're ready for the TV coverage.
Tonight we're getting a first-hand account of what it was like during one of the most tumultuous times in Warren County history. It has been more than 50 years since school desegregation, and the students impacted came back together tonight to recognize where they came from and just how far we have come. It's a story that's new tonight from TV3's Sarah Robarge.
The principal announced our school was going to close. So at first, it would seem like a small vacation.
June Jeffrey was a senior at Warren County High School back in 1958. She says when she found out these doors might stay closed for good, it was scary.
We were seniors, and we needed to know if we were going to graduate.
June's class is called the Lost Class of 59 because many of these seniors never graduated from here. And these doors remained closed until a historic day in February 1959, a day Reverend James Kilby will never forget.
At least 150, 200 protesters, and they were hollering and screaming and telling us to go home and calling us the N-word. 16 years old, you couldn't understand why adults would treat kids that way when you wanted to get your education.
Kilby was one of the Warren County 23, the first black students who integrated Warren County High School after a judge ruled it unconstitutional to keep them out. After unveiling this marker that commemorates their fight for equality, Kilby, Jeffrey, and other members of the Warren County 23 and the Lost Class of 59 walked together through the doors of their high school for the first time in 50 years.
It's a sign of unity, walking up the hill together, being together. We've come a great way. We still have ways to go, but I just believe that we can work together now. It has broken down some of the things that have stood in our way to be here today.
I rejoice today because I've been through the struggle, and now today was peaceful, a day where we could celebrate.
In Warren County, Sarah Robarge, TV3 News.
An emotional moment for sure. The marker is set right outside of the former Warren County High School, which is now the middle school. You can see it as you drive along Luray Avenue.
Well, I hope you can see that in a way, what we were doing there, without really thinking of it in this way, in Front Royal, was a kind of reparations, a community reparations project. Even though it didn't, it was not an expansive reparation effort, it was a small step toward making amends for that history of racial discrimination. And I know many of you think about reparations as being the national level, but this is just an example how you can do it at the local level in your own community. Well, after we worked on this project, I felt good about supporting the family and the community in getting this historic marker put up and the other things we worked on. I again began to think I should do something more personally. Something to make amends for my family having enslaved Betty and James's ancestors, but also everything since. I know my family had participated in Jim Crow oppressions. I remember my father in Baltimore, he was a doctor and he had separate waiting rooms when I was a little girl, and I remember this. And then not just to blame it on all the other family, but my own racism, because I know I grew up in a racist society and a racist household, and I absorbed some of that. So I felt like I should do something myself to make amends. And I went to Betty and to James and said, what do you think I should do? Is there something that you can think of that would be acceptable to you? And Betty said, well, Phoebe, you didn't enslave anybody. You don't need to do anything more than you're already doing. Well, I just couldn't let that go. There had to be something here. And suddenly it hit me, education. This was a family who had put their lives on the line for education. It was so much valued by them. What if I set up a scholarship fund that would benefit descendants of persons my family enslaved? And that would include Betty and James's grandkids. So I took the idea to them, and this was something they could accept. You see, it was not they didn't see it coming to them. They were beyond the college ages, but they knew their grandchildren were coming up in high school and were wanting to go to college and were concerned about having enough money to pay for that college. So it wasn't for them, but they could see something that would help their grandkids. So with their advice and counsel, consultation, in 2014, I established the Kilby Family Endowed Scholarship Fund. And that's up and running. And the first year it awarded one scholarship to James's grandson. He was of the right age. This year, 3 of Betty's grandchildren have received scholarship awards to go to college in this 2021-22 school year. And when Betty and I wrote the book Cousins, we decided that we would donate all our author's proceeds from the sale of the book to that scholarship fund. So we hope you'll buy Cousins and you'll be contributing to the education of young African American kids, as well as you'll be getting the whole story. We've only touched the surface. So I think you'll want to read the book Cousins and purchase it from Busboys and Poets, so that you can get the whole range of things that we have done to get to know each other as a family and to recognize that we truly are cousins connected through slavery. So now it is time for us to stop talking and open up this dinner conversation to hear what you have to say. We would be glad to hear your comments, answer your questions about our story and our book. But Betty wants to say one last thing before we turn it over to you to ask your questions and make comments.
We want to thank you for joining us today. It's been a pleasure having you at our table, experiencing an incredible meal of healing and grace. We encourage you to purchase the book Cousins and to learn the whole story. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So post your comments and we'd love to hear from you. Lori, I think you're muted.
You and my computer both told me that, yes. Thank you both for joining us tonight. Your story, like I say every time, it's just a really beautiful, honestly, it's kind of the history of America itself. If you really think about it, your story and your family, just the legacy you guys have created now for, your grandkids to come. It's really beautiful. And so we do have one question from a Barbara Carter. And Barbara says, so happy to be here. Can you please explain why Betty has the name Kilby? And I'm not sure if in your genealogy search, you guys know exactly where those branch off, but yeah, if you know, let us know.
Well, my maiden name is Kilby. My father was the Kilby that he was the most recent connection to the Kilby family.
But when I was doing my genealogical research, what I found out was my great grandfather's cousin, his family was the one that owned Betty's great great grandmother, Juliet.
Yeah.
And Juliet had 4 children. Well, we know that from a court case where the Kilbys were fighting over who owned Juliet and these 4 kids because they saw them as valuable property. It's pretty disgusting to read this stuff. But the court case was in 1865, and it was never decided because the Civil War ended and slavery ended, and it was moot. But what we do know is that Juliet was, when an emancipation, was a woman alone with 4 kids. And so she decided to take the last name of her enslavers. And so we have records of Juliet Kilby and her 4 kids, and her son Simon is Betty's great grandfather. So that's where Betty gets the name Kilby, and it's from my family, the enslavers. And hi, Barbara. She was a classmate of mine in Baltimore.
Awesome. We've got Ruby Nicole Barnett, who says, I've greatly appreciated your story. As a white descendant of slave owners, I appreciate your journey as a map for my own. How do you think your parents would have felt about this?
When I started to do our family research, My father cried when he realized that his mother and father wasn't married when they had some of their children. So he didn't take the research really well. It's like by the time I came along, I believed in it is what it is. You can't change the past. You can just move forward from it.
Now, as far as my family, my father had passed away long before I started this research. So I don't really know what he would thought, but knowing his racial attitudes, I don't think he would have be very appreciative of what I've been doing. Um, my mother was still alive, but it wasn't her family that did the enslaving. And at this point in her life, she had pretty severe dementia. It wasn't something that I would talk to her about because she hardly knew who I was, much less talking about, complex genealogy. But it's interesting. When I started the research, all my father's generation had passed away in the Kilby family, except one aunt. And she had married into the family, so it wasn't her family that did the enslaving, but she was really interested in history, and her husband, had racist ideas like my father. So I wasn't sure, but I contacted her to see if I thought she might have some information. And when I shared it, she was fascinated by it. And she did what she could to help me. So you never know. So, but then now I have reconnected with some of my white cousins that I hadn't talked to for 40 years. And they're all very supportive. And one of my white cousins, Tim Kilby, is a master genealogist. He just knows everything and knows everything about DNA. And he has done so much research that he has actually taken Betty's family tree and just expanded it. So it's like, I say it's like a mighty monarch tree now, because he figured it all out. And he's posted it on Ancestry.com and connected it with my family so that anybody can see the whole Kilby family if they have a subscription to Ancestry. So it's an important thing to get that out there. But so varied ideas about my family, but mostly supportive.
Awesome. And shout out to Tim. I don't think Juliet would have ever in her wildest dreams imagined that her descendants would ever be able to look right back all the way to 1865. So that's really special.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a special treat with the scholarship, and the children have to know where they came from so they can look back. And I tell them that their ancestors are speaking to them from the grave and have helped to provide these scholarships for them.
I love that. And you kind of dug into what I was going to ask you both, but Phoebe, you said you did a lot of online research to just find Betty and the other Kilbys. What did this research even look like? I can imagine a lot of time spent in the downstairs of a library, in the archives, but for folks who are thinking about kind of doing this journey themselves, how would you recommend them they start?
Well, I always say the first place you start was with your own family. Talk to your grandparents, great-grandparents, whoever's still around that you can talk to. I waited really too late in many ways to talk to family members, but they can often provide a wealth of information. You never know where somebody may not have talked about how they did genealogy and have all this information. And they sometimes have fascinating actual physical evidence. Like when I talked to that aunt who had married into my father's family, when I first spoke to her, I told her Betty's great-grandfather's name Simon, and that sounded familiar to her. And so she said, let me go and look for something. So she went into another room and came out with this beautiful crockery jar, like this big. It was a beautiful handmade jar, very old. And out of it, she pulled a little piece of paper, and on there was a little note written by another aunt saying that this was Uncle Simon Kilby's pickle jar. So that was Betty's great-grandfather's, pickle jar in the hands of my aunt and my white family, and I got to hold it and take photos of it. It was amazing. So you find things like that are just fascinating if you go to a family member. And what helped me is I just Googled the name Kilby, and somebody had a member of the Kilby family, a white Kilby family, had posted a huge family tree online. And this wasn't on Ancestry. They had their own website,
Wow.
Ancestry. And that's where I downloaded a whole bunch of information. But now I tell people, most people aren't maintaining their own family websites anymore because of things like Ancestry.com, and there are others out there. But if you want to get started, one place to look is Ancestry, and you have to have a membership. But most local libraries have subscriptions, so you can go to the library and do it for free. And then when you get hooked, which you will, then you can get your own subscription to Ancestry. But there is a lot out there online, and that's what I would suggest. Start with family members, and then try Ancestry. And if you're African American, sometimes you won't find as much there. There's a special site called OurBlackAncestry.com. OurBlackAncestry.com. And one of our Coming to the Table members established this, and she is particularly helpful in helping you to know where to start, especially if you're African American.
I was going to say that, it comes to mind Morgan Jenkins, Wandering in Strange.
There you go.
Wandering in Strange Lands, for those of you. You two might actually really like this book. It's Daughter of the Great Migration, Reclaiming Her Roots and Looking Back. And she was mentioning how it's hard,
It's very hard for African Americans to find their ancestry because of the way our society is constructed.
Exactly. Like you mentioned, unfortunately, Julia and her kids were considered property and not, humans as they were. So it's really great that there is a new kind of centralized place to send folks to. And what was the name of that again, one more time?
OurBlackAncestry.com.
Awesome. I love to plug things like that.
Yeah.
And let's see. We have got to Marianne Davis, who says, thank you so much. Is the session recorded to share with others? And yes, it is. You can actually find this recorded on YouTube later on, literally right after the program. Same link, folks. And I did want to touch on Hello Cousin. I remember the first time I heard your story, those two words just ended up packing such an emotional punch, and it's such a simple phrase, but it feels so heavy in the context of your story and journey. After integrating your school and experiencing the violence of racism during your childhood, what did it mean for you to get this message from Phoebe? And you did speak a little bit about that already. I guess my question to you is, what, you said, you're kind of it happened. What would you tell folks today who might be getting messages from, their own Phoebes?
The person that Phoebe did not, her name had never come up in any of my research about the horrible part of my past. And so I tell people, you have to look at it with a forgiving and loving heart. Because that person that's reaching out to you is not the one who was back there during that time period, during the injustices. This is an innocent person. So you need to judge this person based on who she is right now, not what happened in the past. And I knew the past from stories being told, but I had never confronted it. But by the time I had written my first book, had looked back over my life, had many successes. I had success in the book, success with having desegregated the schools, success in achieving my education in spite of the obstacles. So I was ready.
Awesome. And then, Phoebe, coming back to you,
Mm-hmm.
what would you say to white teens and young people today who may be exploring their family history and finding, quite honestly, this less than stellar past in history and narrative? I guess my question is, how do you reconcile that, and how do you kind of sit with it? I won't lie to you. As a non-Black person whose parents immigrated to this country, this question is something that I don't have a lot of foundation for myself.
Well, I think we're all a product of our environment currently. And if you look at yourself, are you perfect? Have you never made mistakes? Will people in the future look back at you and wonder about some of the things you did? So if you think about it, the people that were living during the time of slavery were products of their time, and it was very acceptable among many, particularly in the South, to enslave people. I do contend that even though it was legal and many people accepted it, that morally, my family members could have rejected it and didn't. But they were not perfect, and neither am I. And sometimes I think about what will the future look back at us about, and they'll look at us with regard, how did we treat the planet? We were abusing the planet just like our ancestors were abusing their slaves just by enslaving them, right? So each generation has, unfortunately, some of the things that they do that are not perfect. And to pretend we are is really unrealistic. So we can be understanding that others weren't the way we would hope they would be. And it's actually interesting, one along this theme, Betty and I were speaking at the University of Virginia one time. It's a while back before we wrote the book. And it was, the conference was Virginia universities and their race histories. So UVA professors were talking about not only the role of slaves in building, the university and, all that stuff, but they also were looking at more recent times, and they were talking about how the medical school was a center for the study of the pseudoscience, eugenics, in the 20s and 30s. So I'm sitting there in the audience and I'm thinking, I wonder when my father was in medical school here, because my father went to UVA medical school. So I went home and researched it, and I found that he was in medical school while eugenics was being taught. I mean, that's terrific to think about, but maybe it actually made me think, I went to college and I accepted what my science professors told me. So did he, right? So he was a product of his time too, not just his racist family and what came from slavery, but people that he thought had authority and knew, what reality was, what the truth was in science, what he studied in medical school. So we study and learn things today that may not be the truth and may not be perfect or correct. So we have to be, in some ways, I think, forgiving of at least some of these mistakes that they made and we made.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. And one last question, because the last time we had an event for you all, there was a Kilby in the audience.
Yes.
Is there any way for other folks who might think they are part of your Kilby line that can reach out to you in any way?
Sure. Betty has a website, BettyKilby.com. You can email her or contact her through that. And if you have any questions, just send them her way and we'll get back to you.
Awesome. And for those of you at home, the website's also on the screen and was portrayed various times during the program. And without further ado, I am going to do that one last plug. And if you guys could hold up your copy right quick, because it's a gorgeous cover. If you're interested, you can both of them right there. If you're interested in purchasing your copy of Cousins, you can do so tonight on Eventbrite at the same page where you RSVP'd, or you can also go online to bookshop.org or bookshop.com, /shop/busboysbooks. And that will go back into the Busboys and Poets bookstore. And again, all your proceeds go to what?
The scholarship that benefits the descendants of the persons that Phoebe's family once owned.
Yes.
And I have 3 grandchildren right now in college that are benefiting from that scholarship.
Yeah.
And I'm not gonna lie to you, I heard Endowed, so I was like, this is gonna keep going and going till your grandkids have grandkids. So
Right.
And we are getting different people making. We actually heard this week of somebody who listened to our presentation, who decided to put this Endowed Scholarship Fund in their will.
Yes.
Can you believe it? Whoa.
I'm not gonna lie, like, we love to see reparations from white folks like that, putting your money, putting your wealth back into it.
Yes.
Yeah, and I wanted this to last longer than me,
Beautiful.
And me too. And you see, I have 5 great-grandchildren, 9 grandchildren. So I have plenty of people that are in line waiting for this scholarship.
Betty's like, the kids are there. Y'all just need to buy the book.
Yes.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, both Phoebe and Betty, again for joining us tonight. And for those of you at home, thank you for tuning in. Thanks so much, everybody. And have a great evening. Stay safe.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Of course. Peace and love. Bye, everybody.